BoardGameGeek screwed up, and we're going to talk about it today. I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today we're talking about the BoardGameGeek ratings, which, depending on your knowledge on the topic, is either a conversation you're excited for, have no idea where this is going, have heard this, seen this horse beaten to death over it. This is a conversation around how BoardGameGeek ratings work, some of the problems with them, and then how, in my opinion at least, BoardGameGeek screwed up. Now, before we dive into it, it's worth noting that I am tremendously grateful for BGG for a million different things. I genuinely believe that it's the best website on the planet for board games. I believe it offers you an absolute ton of information and does an incredible job on so many different areas that no other site has come close to. I think that's important to say because I think it's very easy for anyone who's number one in any space. I think it's very easy for people to target those people with how they screwed up, what they did wrong, all those things. And while this is genuinely a disagreement with how BoardGameGeek handles some aspects of the ratings, I want to make it very clear that I do think it's an incredible site, and I think no matter what you did with ratings, you would definitely be annoying some people. My issue is their inconsistent approach, or at least seemingly inconsistent approach. But with that, let's start with how the BoardGameGeek ratings work. Now, you can either go ahead and skip to the next timestamp if you already know. You can also watch Shelfside's fantastic video on the rating system, or if you want the very short note of it, the very short version is that every game comes into the system with a certain number of dummy ratings. The very first time, by the way, the games on the table here are just because obviously Gloomhaven and Brass Birmingham are the two current, BoardGameGeek rating conversations, and Gloomhaven was under a stack of games, so I grabbed Frosthaven. I find it's fun to have games on the table. That's it. BoardGameGeek ratings basically give you a certain number of dummy ratings. That means when a new game comes into the system and somebody rates their single baby a 10, so it has one rating as a 10, the average rating on the front end is a 10. But the average actual geek rating is not a 10 because that would make it bad. If you had an actual average rating of a 10 and you sorted high to low on the most highest rated games, everyone who rated their single game a 1 and no one else ever touched it, those would be the most popular games in the system, which is obviously bad. To that end, BoardGameGeek has a certain number of fake dummy ratings in play. That ensures that when your game gets a 10, until you hit a certain threshold, that 10 doesn't come across as a 10 because it's being stacked against all those dummy ratings that are getting in the way. Which again, I think is a good thing. We can debate the number needed, we can debate how many dummy ratings there should be, we can debate whether there should be a different system, but I think the idea that it in some way limits a new game from immediately being at an average of a 10, I think that is a good system in play. Which effectively does mean, though, that BoardGameGeek ratings are a combination of how good a game is and how popular a game is. If a game has 100 people who gave it a 10, those dummy ratings are going to pull it down, and 100 people is a large number. If 100 people gave a game a perfect score, those dummy ratings are going to pull it down in a way that almost seems unfair. That game that is 100 people have defined as being the best game they're playing, and no one else has disagreed, it's still barely going to show up in your feed. On the other hand, a game that has an average rating of an 8, but a lot of people rated it, that may well be in the BoardGameGeek Top 100. And so there is that discrepancy in play, and there is a lack of perfect things. And some of the areas we're not going to deal with here is, I think that the fact that in the BoardGameGeek Top 100, there's only around, 85 games, because the other 15 are duplicates. There's Through the Ages and Through the Ages 4th edition. There's, Agricola and Cavern are different enough that they deserve to be there. We have Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. Those are different games. We have Twilight Imperium 3rd edition and 4th edition. There are so many duplicates in the BoardGameGeek Top 100 that by the time you're done, you're only really down to like 85 or so games, which is a weird way to analyze the Top 100. I think the Crew and the Crew Deep Sea are fantastic, but do we really need two indicators of them to be in that Top 100? You can make arguments yes or no. It is complicated for sure, but I think that the Top 100 is flawed, but I don't have any perfect answers there. Part of the problem, though, the problem we're dealing with today, it's just the very conversation around the ratings themselves. Because at the end of the day, there are a lot of issues with the rating system, and none of them have to do with the amount of dummy ratings there are in play. Because again, I think there might be better ways to handle it, but what they do well, and it achieves the job that for the most part is trying to achieve, and no system will ever be perfect. But there are a lot of issues with people who rate games on BoardGameGeek. A lot of issues. These issues are going to be more near and dear to the hearts of those who have made the games, who have put the games into existence and see their creations being rated a 1 for no good reason. But whether or not it's applicable to your own personal game, it's still a potential problem. There are users who rate every single game they touch a 1, which obviously just isn't true. There are users who rate everything a 10, which again, obviously shouldn't be true. We have users who rate games 10 to counteract the 1s. Hey, there's a whole bunch of fake 1s here, so we're going to give it a 10 to balance it out. There are people who rate 1s to balance out the 10s. There are people who rate games based on their excitement to play, which arguably, according to BGG's own definitions of what a rating means, actually should work. But do you really want people rating a bunch of games based on how excited they are to play it as opposed to having ever touched it? To that end, there are people who rate games that have never come out and do not exist. There are a lot of ratings for games that don't exist, either positive because they're so excited about the game, or they're excited about the company or the designer, or sometimes negative because they hate the company and they have issues with it. There are people who rate games for reasons that don't make sense. Shipping was late on the game, therefore it's a 1 out of 10. Is it though? Is it a 1 out of 10? Because I don't think it is. I don't like the publisher. They screwed up. They use Kickstarter FOMO, so the game's 1 out of 10. But again, is it? That's a rating on the publisher's practices, which, by all means, I think BGG should have a page for publishers where you can rate publishers, and this could be a conversation of how that's handled and different things, but it's not a reflection of the game. Someone who rates a game a 1 because it's Command or it's Steamforged, or they have some problem with that company, that just seems like a weird reason to rate a game, and arguably it should not be allowed, because it is another data point against the game that in no way reflects the actual game. There's bandwagon ratings. People jumping on bandwagons. That happens a lot, especially with games like Ark Nova, where some people jump in and it quickly rises to the top as everyone's talking about it. And it's not so much about how good it is, but it is about the hype and the buzz, and everyone wants to be a part of the ascent to the top. There's times where you have Brask and Gloomhaven, which is Frosthaven here, Brask and Gloomhaven facing off against each other, and people taking sides, jumping on one side of the bandwagon versus the other, giving Brass a 10 and Gloomhaven a 1, just so you can see the ratings flip, when obviously we all recognize and know that at least one of those ratings is not true. They are just being put there for whatever reason. There's inconsistency to the meaning of the ratings. BoardGameGeek has their own meaning system, and so many people don't subscribe to that meaning system, which means so your one might be different than my one. And that means, again, it's another problem with the rating system. We have pushing your audience to rate games. This happens on a regular basis where people will incentivize the audience, please go ahead and rate their game, and they may or may not use the word positively, but you'll have creators who are like, hey, for this stretch goal, we push our audience to rate games. All of these things are effectively flaws with how accurate a rating can be. You can't rate a game that doesn't exist yet. Again, technically by BGG's own standards of how excited you are to play a game, you could rate it. It's complicated. This is a problem. What's the point? What's the takeaway? Well, for the most part, BoardGameGeek doesn't get involved. For better or for worse. Whether you agree or disagree. That person who has 7,000 ratings of a game that are just a 1, BoardGameGeek doesn't touch it. They don't get involved. And I can respect that. To an extent. Because to me, from my own perception, and tell me if you agree or disagree with this, from my own perception, there are effectively 3 reasons for them to not get involved within their ratings. I can only think of 3. Maybe there's more. The first reason would be because they don't agree that it's a problem. Maybe they sit there and say, who knows, that person who rated every single game a 1, that has a legitimate, genuine rating, and we're fine with it. Maybe the person who's rating a game doesn't exist yet, maybe they're like, no, that's a reasonable rating. The shipment's late, and so they rated the game. They don't like Command's use of Kickstarter practices, so they rated the game. Whatever reason there is, maybe they agree that those ratings should be allowed to exist, and they should be there. Meaning it's not a lack of disagreement, they are fine with it. They agree that this is a good, accurate use of the rating system that reflects useful information to consumers. That's option 1. I hope that that's not the reason. My assumption is that's not the reason. I think there are a lot of areas where we can have wiggle room of agreeing or disagreeing, especially like bandwagons. I mean, if I jump on a bandwagon, maybe I do think Ark Nova's a 10, but I only happen to be rating it because everyone else is rating it. Does that make my rating invalid? It's still valid, but then again, if I'm not rating other games, we can have disagreements and discrepancies over different areas. But if you haven't played the game, should you be rating the game? That feels like it feels like a fairly obvious cutoff. This game doesn't exist. Why does it have 700 people who have rated it? I don't understand. Even if you're playing it based on prototypes of that, there's not going to be that large a pool, and then things will change. I don't understand how you can possibly agree with it, but again, they might. That's option 1. Option 2 is lack of technology. That you don't have the tools in place to be able to change ratings. Which I think they do. How far those tools extend, I don't know, but I think they do have the tools to in some way adjust or account for ratings. There are all kinds of systems you can put into place in any rating system. IMDb does it, Rotten Tomatoes does it. Most other rating systems have some degree of making sure there's no bot accounts and double checking against this or that or the other. I don't know their tools or how they execute, but there are a lot of systems out there that in some way do mess with ratings, and BGG certainly has the capability to do it in some situations. How and where they apply it, I don't know, but a lack of technology could be a realistic answer. You can't have somebody, realistically, I don't expect somebody to be trawling any individual rating and finding it out. And what scripts could you have in place? What automatic systems and software do you have to flag incorrect ratings? I don't know, but lack of technology could be one. And reason number 3, which I assume is their reason, but I could be wrong, this is an assumption on my end, is it's a never-ending battle if you start getting involved. And reluctantly, I respect that reason. Reluctantly, I respect the idea that deciding where and when to get involved in the accuracy of a rating system does mean that, well, you got involved here, but not there. You got involved here, but not there. Why do you agree with this and not that? As soon as you ever get involved in a single discussion around how and where to change a rating on a game, you open up the door for a conversation of why did you do it here and not there? Does that mean you agreed with this one being invalid, but you don't agree with that one being invalid? And I think that's an entirely reasonable approach. Except for one small thing. As far as I know, they do get involved, which kind of throws apart the other arguments. I don't know how often, I don't know where and when, but I do know there are times when companies on crowdfunding campaigns have asked their users to go and rate games highly, and BGG has reached out to those creators and said, hey, if you don't take those things down, we will shut down your ratings entirely. We will close them off. I don't know if it means deleting ratings. I don't know if that means turning off the games that doesn't show a rating. I don't know the exact system or responses in play, but they have told companies, no. What you're doing is wrong. The way you're approaching it is wrong. It calls into question the accuracy and the veracity of the ratings in a way that we are not okay with. And I'm okay with that, except for one small problem. By opening that door, by in any way engaging with any form of rules and regulations around where someone is or isn't allowed to rate a game, regardless of what open-ended system there is, by doing it once, it now calls into question every single other time they don't do it. Why is that a good time to shut things down, but 700 ratings on a game that doesn't exist is okay? Why is that okay to shut down, but the person who rates every single game a 1 and doesn't do anything else okay? Why is that something you can shut down, but people who post in the comments just rating to counteract, rating it because I don't like command, rating because I don't like stretch goals, why are all those okay? By opening the door to a single instance where they did modify and adjust and put in rules in place other than simply having a system where you can rate things, they open the door to the conversation. Which means now it comes down to, is it lack of technology? Do you actually agree in some instances and not others? Don't get me wrong, I can point to why that situation is different. I can point to, well, that's a company manipulating ratings, but does it matter? Does it matter what the reason is? Because all of them will have differences. Every single instance will have a difference, but at least we can all agree that a company incentivizing its backers to rate a game highly, we can all agree that is an intentional obfuscation of the rating system in a way that minimizes how useful ratings are. We can agree with that sentence. But I think we can agree with that too when people are rating a game that doesn't exist yet. When people are rating a game they haven't played yet. And if we can agree with it here and we can agree with it here, why did you get involved in one place and not somewhere else? What's the takeaway of this video? No major takeaway. I think the main takeaways for me are I appreciate BoardGameGeek tremendously. I think it does a lot of things that are very useful for the hobby and has done a tremendous job of creating and growing the hobby. And also, I completely and totally disagree with the way they handle their rating system and that agreement, whatever leeway I personally would have for the idea of never getting involved in anything, that kind of goes out the window now that they are getting involved. And so I'm curious what their stance is internally. But ultimately, I think I just disagree. On a separate note, my ideal rating system, something I've talked about in other videos, is I kind of wish we had a Rotten Tomatoes type system. Something that kind of aggregated the critics and aggregated the audience and put some sort of public ratings in play based on a binary system, not based on a 10-point system or a 5-point system, but based on a binary liked or didn't like system that would ultimately give you some sort of score around how good a game is based on the audience and the critics. And I think the distinction between the audience and the critics is useful. People pay a lot of attention to the critics. They pay a lot of attention to the reviewers on YouTube or a blog post anywhere of what their opinion is. Whereas I think that having a distinction between the two and having some sort of algorithmic algorithmic, not algorithmic, aggregated system like Rotten Tomatoes, I think would be a real boon for the hobby. I also think it's a lot of work, and I think it's a good idea, but I'm not willing to go through that work. And that's it. That's the conversation around the ratings, how they work, many of the potential issues, take them with a giant grain of salt, and ultimately, in some way, I hope at some point, BoardGameGeek does decide to put more safeguards, rules, algorithms in place to in some way improve the system. It will never be perfect. It will never be something that everyone agrees with. Inherently, you're going to make some people happy and some people unhappy, but I think there are steps you can take towards something that more people would agree is better. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from BoardGame Co. Let me know your thoughts on the subject. And as always, I hope you have a good one.